she just like repeats herself over and over.
Yeah.
A
Oh,
lot of my online classes, teachers just read. So I feel like I do better not watching them. I watched them, but just why did I just watch that?
And then they don't teach in this class. Is there like an accounting book that they have in the library that can kind of help out?
yeah, talk to Kim
Okay.
or Scott, because of course he's gone now. But yeah, or talk to Nate or Katie.
Yeah, because I'm like, accounting is kicking my butt, and like, I'm a hands-on, so I like the book. I don't like the e-stuff. I don't like that.
Yeah.
But like, if I had like the accounting book, it would help me out so much.
And yeah, so I think they probably have texts, but let's see, Christy, Amanda, Nate, Katie, all of them have access to the library if there's no librarian here. So either Scott, who was sitting here shortly ago, or Kim will be more than happy to help you. So that's how I'd approach it. You might talk to Linda as well and see if she has a recommendation. And I don't know if she's here tonight.
She left already. She was here.
Yeah, I knew she was here. Monday night she was running an online class, I think, in the other room, but
Yeah,
tonight she isn't.
I work Monday nights. That's why I'm not here, but I have to do it on Wednesdays.
Okay. Well, if you're working Monday nights, then I will be recording all of the classes. So usually by the next morning, I should have an email out to everyone with the link to the video. It just takes processing time, and I'll try and get tonight's class online tonight when I get home. But it depends on just how long it takes YouTube to upload it and convert it. So we'll have to see. Let's now pick up and go looking at chapter 8, which is data. We collect at the public health level, since we're interested in the health of the population, we collect a broad variety of data and do a lot of statistical analysis on the data as we go. The data is a funny thing, because when we start doing surveys and so forth, people are suspicious, as they should be, if somebody they have no idea who it is calling and asking you personal questions. But the data are necessary. We have a number of different ways of collecting data in the community. There are public databases, and there are semi-public databases that are available to people with the right need to know. And I say that the semi-public database would be things like birth and death records, marriage records, and so forth. Those are literally public, but you can't just access it. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to obtain dual citizenship with Ireland, where my grandfather was born. But I needed to get my grandfather's birth certificate, which I had to obtain from Ireland. I had to get his death certificate. He died in New York. In New York, in order for someone who is not an immediate family member to get a copy of a death certificate, you have to have permission from the nearest living relative. And it took me a while to convince my father to give me permission to get a hold of not only his birth certificate, but my grandfather's death certificate. So these things are not necessarily readily available. Plus, there is HIPAA. A lot of health information has to be voluntarily given. When a doctor reports an infectious disease, he doesn't name an individual. Or if he does, that individual's name is redacted from the public records because it's a HIPAA issue. And we all know about HIPAA. We've all studied it. You probably wrote a dozen papers on it when you were in your associate's degree program, because it's critical. And so we're very careful about these things. But the data are used to assess the health of the community, but also they're raw material for research in the areas that we need research. If we're looking at the spread of disease, and this is something that's especially done, if you've ever played the game Pandemic, it is about an effort to eradicate disease before it just basically wipes out the planet. Okay, so it's a game actually that teaches you a lot about what goes into dealing with these things. The movie Outbreak does a semi-decent job of it, but it has too much Hollywood crap in it for me. But it does a good job of explaining things about research and about what happens in a public health crisis, or what could happen. So we have various sources. We have local records. I just mentioned birth and death certificates. There's other kinds of information that are available. What we call the notifiable diseases. Every doctor has a list of diseases that if he diagnoses a case in his patient population, he must report to the health authorities, because mostly these are infectious diseases, because other things, heart disease is not contagious. Cancer is not contagious for the most part. Diabetes is not a contagious disease. So these are not necessarily notifiable diseases from an infectious disease standpoint, although they are diseases of interest because we're trying to track the growth of these things. And so they go to the state level, and then they go to the CDC, to their Center for Health Statistics. We also have surveys. We have the census every 10 years. By constitutional mandate, we do a census in this country. And a census is a survey in which everyone in the population, every person, is a part of the survey. And that's the idea with the decennial census. A number of years ago, when I was thinking very seriously about how much more work I wanted to do, I joined the Census Service for a summer and did follow-ups on people who did not return their census forms. So we would go out to people's homes, and I mean, I went sometimes out into the boonies hunting for people to deliver these forms and get the data. There are people who won't do it, but we probably have a 99.99% success rate at contacting Americans, which is pretty good, and getting this information. It is a way of us. We don't ask disease information in a census, but what we do get is age, gender, race, ethnic background, a few other things. We'll collect religious data for those kinds of census information. What is the distribution? But all of this goes into then giving us a basis for going through and doing other kinds of surveys. There are many of them that are done. That some of them are general surveys of what the community is about. These are ongoing. Some of them are continual over the years. Some of them have turned into major sources of information. You may remember from your Pharmacy 209 class, the Framingham Heart Survey, Framingham Heart Study. Framingham is a city in Massachusetts, and decades ago, the city was the source of following people, looking at their lifestyles and what and their health status. So we were monitoring cholesterol, and we were monitoring other lifestyle issues, smoking, and many other aspects, and relating that to it was basically to cardiac death. And this has been going on now for decades. We've gone through several generations of participants. And so this has served as a tremendous tool in looking at the health of Americans, and is still ongoing and will be ongoing for a long time. There are many other surveys. We look at some surveys of risk, behavioral risk. In other words, extreme sports, drugs, alcohol, driving while drunk, unprotected sex, all these things that are health risks. We will do this. The problem with the youth behavioral risk survey is that it is high school students. So high school dropouts are missed. And to think that they're not prone to some of these same risks and risky behaviors is pretty naive. So we are not, there are issues with all of this. All surveys are voluntary, but we like to have big numbers. When you you haven't taken statistics yet, or did you take it online? You took it with me. Okay. That must have been the first time I taught the class then. Yeah, I remember now. Have you taken statistics? Well, you remember, the bigger the numbers you have, the more accurate the predictions you can make or the conclusions you can draw. So we, in these surveys, we will do thousands and thousands of people. We'll keep working until we have that many people involved. But like any survey, we're dependent on truthfulness in the answers. So surveys and all of these other interview type and data, form fill out type things have their limitations, but they give us information. They give us a baseline to look. If we know that we've interviewed, say, 10,000 youth, and we know that 500 of them are involved in some very risky activity, and I'll say, experimenting maybe with hard drugs. This gives us a handle as to broadly throughout the population, if we can get a good distribution of all of the of all potential groups, we can get a good idea of how this translates into the population as a whole. They are data, and surveys are one way of getting them. How accurate is it? Well, there's no such thing as a perfect data collection form. I've worked with the census forms, and I've worked with a lot of it, and I've had people look at me and say, well, what if I'm African American father and Native American mother? What ethnic group am I in? So they're imperfect in that respect. And I use that example because we have a very good friend whose father was African American, whose mother was Native American, and she has like 8 brothers and sisters, and it's like looking at an international community. The way the genetics expressed. I mean, that family has everything from dark, almost looking like someone who is an African, to a couple of, to one of her siblings would, you would never guess that they were anything other than a Northern European. So, you know, you just, the data collection has issues. The best of these is the census, because we hit 300 million people with that census. That is a database of unbelievable size. Still, we missed some, as I said. You know, when I was doing the census follow-up, we would make 3 attempts to contact someone, and then if they would not answer the door, if they would not respond to us, we would drop them. And that, you know, there are some people who will not. I remember getting into a really interesting discussion with a guy who was just, he was just livid during, I think it was the 1980 census. I was living in North Carolina, and this guy was very much opposed to the government knowing anything about him. He didn't realize how much they knew anyway, but he was very much opposed. And he was railing one day about the government has no right to ask me these questions, blah, 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 blah. What gives them the right to do that? And one of my friends looked at him and said, how about the United States Constitution? You want me to point out the article that says they have to do a census? Well, that was the end of that discussion. He didn't want to talk about that because he didn't want to deal with it. I have no idea if he ever responded. But anyway, we have the ability now, using information technology, to get a lot of information. We can derive a lot by inference, just by knowing a name, by being able to interview neighbors, etc. We can get a lot of information that's not direct. Confidential. Governments, you know, right now, you have to wait 80 years to be able to publicly access a census. So that if you are doing, I think it's 80, if you're doing genealogical research on your family, you can't access the census until they're that old. And the reason is, by that time, we're assuming that essentially everybody's gone. Now that may have to raise because the average, you know, people are living longer. I told you I have a 98-year-old mother-in-law. My father's 101. So people are living longer. And so we may end up raising that limit. But right now we can do that. But in many cases, data can be provided that has been scrubbed of identifying information. For instance, we no longer, we used to actually take social security numbers in census data. We no longer do that because of all of the problems with identity theft and hacking. We use access and use of the data, and there are plenty of research organizations that can get access to recent censuses, but they have to submit a research plan. It has to be approved by an institutional review board, or what they call here a data protection committee. But really, basically, what we want to do is be sure that there is the information being collected does not include anything that can identify individuals, because of privacy laws and because of legitimate fears about such things. So here we have a question. What are some possible sources of error in records being collected on things like births and deaths? And this is kind of a controversial question: spontaneous fetal deaths and induced abortions. What are some of the sources of error? Don't everybody speak at once. Well, if you look at what's on the shared screen, I hope that's on the shared screen, on the slide, Vital statistics are the most accurate and complete data collected on the American population, yet there are many errors in the information that's submitted. What are some of the possible sources of error in birth, death, spontaneous fetal death, and induced abortion? So we're limiting the field to a few areas. There's going to be sources of error in every data field. But what are some of the sources for those four? Layla, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, all right. You weren't saying anything, so.
Microsoft Word uninstalled itself from my computer, so.
Okay. That's not good.
No, I went to try and start typing, and I can't open any of my files, so.
Well, you may have to bring your computer in and have Cody take a look at it.
Yeah.
So anyway, the question on the table is sources of error in these four data fields: births, deaths, spontaneous fetal death, and induced abortion.
I don't know. That's kind of a hard one for me because I don't know a lot about the subjects.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll make a few suggestions then. Sometimes there are flat out errors in the records. Okay. Wrong names on birth and death records, wrong dates. Sometimes the records are simply lost. You know, nowadays with things being electronic, the loss is not as likely as it used to be because of all the backup systems people have in place. But if you're going and looking for something old, if the courthouse burned down, then all the records went with it. So you don't have the information at all. And that happened when we were looking at my wife's family, which her father came from the hills of eastern Kentucky. So they did not have sophisticated systems, and it was very difficult to find any information about the family at all. And what was there had many things that we knew were incorrect because they lied. People will lie. That's
Right.
another one, especially when it comes to things like abortions. They will lie about abortions, or they simply won't report them. The other thing is, pardon? Go ahead, Layla.
Well, with all the controversy that's always surrounded abortions, it's not really a surprise that they won't. That nobody ever comes forward about them.
No, that's true. Layla's pointing out with the controversy surrounding abortion, it's not surprising that people wouldn't come forward with that information. The other thing is spontaneous fetal deaths. Well, that can happen anytime during a pregnancy, and you might not even know it's happened. You just might suddenly have a heavy bleed. And that's it. You don't know. I think that happens a lot more than we have any idea. And I think it happens because the process of integration of egg and sperm doesn't go right. And what is there, the body says that ain't human and kicks it out. That's my opinion. But anyway, so those are some possible sources in those records. But it is something that is there. And in terms of births and deaths, those are usually fairly straightforward. It's usually a clerical error. And it's an error. It's not a deliberate hiding of information. It's an error. That's why we before records were kept, the primary source for birth and death records was family Bibles, where people kept a record that went back generations. Misspelling of the names. Good point, Brandy. Yeah.
My son, I wanted my son to be college and know they and a lot of people just look at it and like don't see the extra A. So,
Yep. Yeah, use a different spelling.
or like us, our names are spelled different, but
We're both Brandy.
Yep.
Hers was an I, mine's an IE.
Yep.
So,
And I know a Brandy with a Y.
yeah.
So yeah. Well, my younger daughter's name is Charisse, and we spell it Cheresse, and we named her after my wife's best friend from her childhood, who's never going to have any children. Unfortunately, was unable to bear children. So we named our daughter after her. I have seen at least 20 different spellings of Charisse. I thought this was such an unusual name. Then I kept running into Charisse. And I just, so it's, spellings can be different. Mistaken dates or illegibility for handwritten records. The old days, now everything's done by computer. So, typos, fumble fingers like me putting the data in, it happens. So, but really nowadays, with information systems being what they are, things are improving in that line. So we're not having as many errors, but they do exist. Okay. I'm just going to talk about this. The next one here is, why did the Census Bureau propose to use statistical sampling in conducting the year 2000 census? They undoubtedly did to save money. Now remember, in statistics, you learned that the difference between a population and a census was a population was a subgroup of the entire universe of potential subjects. So in the United States, the entire universe of the 2020 census is going to probably be something in the range of 325 to 330 million people at our rate of growth. So that's an expensive proposition. Putting that together, mailing it out, getting it back, having the data processing people enter the information, and the way they do this to make sure it's accurate is that they will actually go through and check the data. They'll double enter it, check it, and then they'll take a sample of the data and try to find their error rate. They'll take a significant sample, go through there and do a paper record to electronic record visual comparison and note any errors. And what we find is, if we do this right, that error rate is infinitesimally small, and what we would call statistically insignificant. But some of the, so why? Probably to save money. But it does not give you an accurate number. And there was a lot of protest because people, especially states that were losing population, they were very much afraid they'd lose representation in Congress, because that's the whole purpose of the census, is to apportion the representation in Congress. So the membership of the House of Representatives is currently fixed at 435. And that's spread across the entire nation. So every year, with moving of population, some states get more and some states lose some. With one exception, you can't go below 1. But there are a couple of states that have only 1 representative in Congress because they don't have enough people. Can you think of some reasons why people might not be counted? You just miss them. You just miss them. And you're not getting a clear number. They're not counted because there's no effort made to find them. Okay. So when we're collecting data, we really want to collect the data. Okay, I'm not going to get into that. Okay. You can answer these questions to yourself. I suggest you think about this. And you would have to visit the Census Bureau site, which is going to give you overall numbers. If you want to know the population of Loveland and the census of 2010, you can get that information. You can also get the current estimate. We won't get an exact count until 2020. But we can see if it's increasing or decreasing. Well, those of us who live in Loveland know it's increasing. Okay, we can see it.
Greeley is like coming so far out towards Loveland.
Yeah. Do you know that Greeley owns Lake Loveland?
No.
They own the water. That's Greeley's. That's part of Greeley's water supply.
Really?
Yep. Mm-hmm. So Loveland residents got E. coli, but Greeley got the water. Yeah. Okay. And you can look at age distribution. You can look at ethnic distribution in the city. You can get that information. You just can't get detailed information about individuals. Summary information is available under this. Okay. All right. So we're going to quit there on that one. And we've got about 40 minutes left. I'd like to jump to chapter 10. And again, I'll emphasize this says third edition, but it's applicable. Resurgence of infectious disease. It's a little bit out of date. This book, the third edition, was written in 2011. Our book is 2017, which is why I would love to get a hold of more data. But basically, we've made some changes here. I remember the whole thing around the outbreak of AIDS. My daughters and most of their friends have never known a time when AIDS was not a part of our society. Okay. When it appeared, it scared the dickens out of everybody. An AIDS patient would be in the hospital and healthcare workers wouldn't go in, would not treat them. People from the food service would put their food tray outside the door, knock on the door and say, your food's here, and then run away because they didn't know how the disease was transmitted. They had no idea how difficult it is actually to transmit AIDS. You can't do it by casual contact. So we have drugs. We have a lot of drugs. It says here there's no cure. In the intervening years, there have been some apparent cures. We cannot say there is an absolute cure because what we've seen with this is using specific cocktails of drugs, and every year there's new drugs approved for treating AIDS. Using cocktails of drugs, we can reduce the virus load in the serum of patients to below detectable levels, which sounds like a cure, except that we can't say that. We don't know what's going to happen if these people go off the drugs. Is the virus going to come back? We don't know yet. But we know how to suppress it to where people are asymptomatic and we can't detect the virus anymore. Okay, so AIDS is one. So we know the various routes. I won't bother with that. There's lots of speculation. We're speculating that it was a cross species, a zoonotic disease. It came from monkeys or apes in Africa, probably through people eating those apes. That's speculation because we know that there's a very similar virus known as SIV, simian immunosuppressing virus, that works exactly the same way apparently as HIV. So we are supposing. And there's lots of examples of diseases that cross species lines. Tuberculosis and smallpox both came from cattle. We know that pigs carry viruses that infect us. There's bird flu. We have toxoplasmosis from cats. Sometimes the disease has no effect on the carrier animal, and sometimes they do. Swine flu, infects pigs and infects humans. So we know, we know that this can happen, and we haven't, I don't think, proven yet the theory that it actually came from a great ape. Others, we've got Ebola. We've all heard about that. There was another outbreak last week in the Congo. Ebola is a very nasty, it's what we call a hemorrhagic fever. Monkeypox and hantavirus, both are hemorrhagic fevers. What they do is they cause widespread bleeding, often in the intestinal tract, associated with just the basic loss of ability to maintain the blood supply. We've heard a lot about West Nile. I heard an estimate that anybody living in Colorado probably has antibodies to West Nile. I have no idea if that's true. It's probably not true that anybody living in Colorado does, but I think it's probably pretty widespread, asymptomatic. Would I get tested for it? Probably not. No symptoms. Sort of like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So as long as I have no symptoms, why would I spend my time? SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. These have come along. What happens? Well, why does this happen? Happens for a lot of reasons. Human activities take us into areas where there are many microorganisms that we have no idea about. We've only identified a small fraction of the microorganisms on this planet. There are billions of species. If you take viruses, bacteria, fungi, and protozoa, there are billions of species of microbe. Most of them cannot infect us because most of them can't live in the conditions of our body. But of those that can, even of those that can, only a small proportion of them are dangerous. So we have no idea what's out there. So the more we inhabit part of the world, the more we move around, the more we come in contact with them. International travel. We talked about that. You can go anywhere in the world in a short period of time. The hardest place to get to might be Antarctica. And they're doing tourist trips there now. So, we're seeing these things. International distribution of food and animals, exotic animals. Well, animals carry microorganisms. So then we're finding that food does. We get food from all over the world. We have no idea what it's like. And then, sexual behavior and intravenous drug use. We talked earlier about influenza, and the vaccine has to be changed literally every year. And periodically we'll have a nasty outbreak, and we'll have a lot of people die. The so-called Spanish flu, which really originated apparently in Belgium, in 1918 to 19, killed an unknown estimated 20 to 40 million people worldwide. The first outbreak in the United States was at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, in a group of soldiers who came back from Belgium. And it killed millions here in the United States. We got bird flu in Asia. We got all sorts of bacterial diseases that come out. Periodically we hear about this E. coli strain 0157H7. that appears in the food. It is a very nasty. E. coli is a nasty infection to begin with. When it gets where it doesn't belong. E. coli is part of our gut bacteria, but when it gets elsewhere in the body, it raises havoc. Remember one time in the South Pacific, we were staying in a house with about 20 young people, a guest house in the country of Western Samoa, and everybody got sick. And what had happened was that we had a period of rain where in 24 hours we had 24 inches of rain, 8 of which fell in 3 hours. And the water system in Apia was basically just a holding settling tank. So what happened is all of the animal feces, human feces, animal feces, and everything washed off the side of the mountain into the pool, and it didn't have time to settle out. And so we realized we were in trouble when it was too late, when the water started coming out of the tap brown. And we had one poor kid who we had to hospitalize because he had nausea and diarrhea, and he got himself so dehydrated we had to take him to the hospital. And fortunately, we had a bunch of medical students who were there on a rotation from New Zealand. And all of them were sick. I was the only healthy person in the house, and I was sent down to the hospital to get drugs for everybody. And we cured our disease that way. But when it happens, it can range anywhere from, I had basically, a bit of diarrhea. I was not feeling bad at all the way to this poor kid we had to hospitalize. So the other thing is antibiotic resistance. If you have read my post on the discussion for this week, I go into that topic in a little more detail. So I won't bother going in here, except that improper use of antibiotics, not just by the medical profession, but by patients, is a big portion of the problem with antibiotic resistance. Which is why nowadays, if you get a prescription from a doctor for an antibiotic, they will tell you very, very specifically, and the pharmacist will tell you, take the entire prescription, even if you feel better, because it's necessary. And also, we overuse antibiotics in agriculture. Tuberculosis. We thought we had it licked. Tuberculosis was endemic in this country for a long time. The major hospitals down in Denver, Lutheran, Swedish, Porter, St. Joe's, all of them started as tuberculosis treatment centers. And in fact, the National Jewish Respiratory Hospital down in Denver was started by the Jewish Consumptive Relief Society, also known as JCRS. And they evolved into the major hospital complexes down there they are today, but people would come out to Colorado for the dry, cold air. And those that would go up to places like Leadville, where it was much higher, much colder, and they would and it would suppress their disease. It wouldn't cure them. But some of the early guys from the West history here, Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp, all of these guys were tuberculars, and they came out to the West to cure their disease. Tuberculosis is widespread in the world. It's coming back with a vengeance here in the United States. It's really a major problem in group health situations. This is truly a public health issue, and how to deal with it. Homeless shelters are tubercular incubators. Crowded places like India are where the most resistant strains are coming, because the Indian government is actually giving a lot of antibiotics to its population, but they don't take it all because they can't afford it. You know, the Indian government only has so much that they can invest, and they can't afford the expensive drugs, so they have older drugs, and so they have a major risk of tuberculosis, and we're starting to see um, um, that that the treatment course for tuberculosis with drugs is months at a time, and it. You know, we have developed multi-drug resistant strains, and now we're beginning to see, well, we went too far. We're beginning to see extremely drug resistant strains of tuberculosis, meaning that almost no drug treatments work in these strains. This is scary because we don't have a lot of antibiotics. We know that we can cure it, but it takes a lot of effort. Are you familiar with prions? Prions are mutated pieces of protein that get into the brain and cause something we call a spongiform encephalopathy. And what happens is, pardon?
Cannibalism.
Well, kuru comes from eating the brains of your enemies, yeah. That's one of the places. But in Europe, it came through cows. We call it the disease that they're calling is Creutzfeldt-Jakob. That's the name of the disease. Is seen sporadically, but the spongiform encephalopathy that we call mad cow disease in the UK came from the fact that in order to produce more beef animals for consumption, they started feeding them ground up unusable parts of sheep, which include the central nervous system. So they were feeding herbivores animal products. And in sheep had a disease called scrapie. Now, I don't know if you've ever spent any time around sheep, but you know, a mad cow and people that have the dementia associated with CJD, sheep are so stupid you can't tell that they're messy. So you just don't know. But they have a disease called scrapie, which was then became BSE, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, and when the cows started being fed sheep remains, including the central nervous system, the spinal column and the brain and so forth of sheep, things that people wouldn't eat. So we saw this happen. There are other prion diseases. One of them, Layla mentioned cannibalism, is known as kuru, and it was seen in, I think, New Guinea originally, because there when the tribes would go to war, it was considered appropriate to, and an honor to your enemy, to eat his brains after you killed him. And so
it was
people,
also a family ritual.
yeah, and to some extent, yes, Layla just pointed out it was a family ritual, but it really meant that we were taking all of this brain and nervous tissue and consuming it along with these mutated proteins that when they got into the brain, they would create holes to where the brain would look like a big sponge. So it'd be full of holes. So when next time you want to tell somebody that he's full of holes, or his brain is full of holes, you might be right. You just don't know. So what are we doing about this? Well, part of it is surveillance. Part of it is paying attention. That's why the CDC has people all over the world, all the time, looking at potential disease outbreaks. You better believe they're monitoring things like the Ebola outbreaks that we're seeing in Central Africa right now very carefully. But they're also monitoring things like the outbreak of Zika virus down in Brazil, because it has migrated into the United States now. So we have a tremendous amount of surveillance, and we want to watch for the veterinary issues, because many of these things are transmitted by animals. We have to find ways of developing new therapies. Drug companies have largely cut back on developing antivirals or antibiotics. There are a number of small companies and now medium to large companies that are working in expensive therapies to cure viral diseases like hepatitis C and HIV. But we don't have a big effort at advanced antibiotics, meaning antibacterial drugs. One of my concerns is with the change in climate that we're seeing, which is also considered a public health crisis, because one of the predictions that I heard was that Denver by 2050 will have the climate that currently we see in Las Cruces, New Mexico. So dry, hot, no snow, and this place will be uninhabitable. But I'm concerned about fungal diseases because right now we're seeing more and more fungal diseases. The most common fungal diseases, things like athlete's foot and chlamydia and a few others and yeast infections that people have. But these are not particularly, they're annoying, but they're rarely major health risks if they're treated properly. But I'm concerned that we're going to see a rise in fungal diseases as the climate changes. We're seeing interesting patterns of rainfall changing. I don't know about you, but I've been amazed at how wet this summer has been here in this area. I mean, I look at the humidity reading in Loveland this morning. When I got up, it was 90%. And that's just, that's a great way to have fungal growth, because they like warm, moist places. So I'm concerned about that as well. We don't talk about it too much. We've talked about bioterrorism. Bioterrorism is something that we think of as not necessarily public health, but it is. We've had at least one bioterror attack in this country, and that was simultaneous with the 2001 airplane attacks in September. Right after that, about a month after that, we started having people being exposed to and dying from anthrax spores. And it was traced to a lab and to a scientist who then committed suicide. So we never were able to prove that he was the source. But a number of people died, and that was bioterrorism.
And wasn't that also like on envelopes?
It was in envelopes, and in some cases, like there was a woman who was, most of them occurred in small areas, and there was one case in Florida, and what they figured was that her mail got contaminated by another piece that was going elsewhere and got to her. She died. So there's been a number of cases where we've seen attempts. We brag about our success in wiping out smallpox around the world. There hasn't been a confirmed case of smallpox since 1979. Maybe a couple of suspected cases, but I said not confirmed. But we still have smallpox stocks in the United States, undoubtedly in Russia, Also, undoubtedly in France and Britain. And they would be a perfect bioterror weapon because we have lost our immunity. And smallpox in a susceptible population is extremely deadly. It is part of what wiped out the Native American population between smallpox and measles, and a couple of other things like malaria. But we wiped out a lot of our native population that way. So bioterrorism is something that becomes a public health issue. Even in the New York attacks, the particulate matter that came from the disintegration of the World Trade Towers. If you look at pictures of that, there was this cloud of stuff. Well, guess what was in those bloody buildings? Lots of asbestos, because they were built before asbestos was banned. Concrete particles, glass particles, in the air, suspended and being breathed. So, and actually public health organizations got involved in trying to mitigate what was going on. Okay. Let's just take a look at a couple of these discussion questions because I think we're going to end in a few minutes. The spread of emerging infections. There is, you remember from your Med 104, the cycle of infection. There's an infectious disease. There's a reservoir where it's stored. There's a mode of transmission. There's a mode of infection, and then there is a phase of growth, and then it starts over again. Okay, so anywhere in that chain, we can stop the spread of a disease in theory. Okay, so you have actually there's a mode of egress from the reservoir, a mode of transmission, and a mode of entry into the next recipient. So, but theoretically, we could stop any of those places. We could stop the spread of disease. Practically speaking, if you want to stop the spread of, say, malaria is spread by mosquito bites. It also can be spread by transfusion, blood sharing needles even. But mainly mosquito bites. How are you going to stop mosquitoes from biting? Well, you can't muzzle them. 1 trillion mosquitoes muzzled? Boy, there's an interesting task. You can put on something that makes the mosquito not want to land on you, but they're pretty toxic substances too. So, is that a good idea? I don't know. So what you want to do is you want to eliminate the reservoir. Well, we've tried that. And it doesn't work real well. Loveland has a mosquito killing program. And yet I still kill mosquitoes at my house periodically because it's not perfect. It can't be perfect. It's just not physically possible. In North Carolina, where we lived for 20 years, you'd drive down the road and you'd see a place where somebody, for some reason, was just collecting old tires. Well, in North Carolina, where we get 54 inches of rain a year, old tires fill up with water. Guess who comes and lives there? Mosquitoes. They're big mosquito farms. And yet every effort made to get people to get rid of those failed. They wouldn't do it. So we can do that. We can try and eliminate the vector. We can try and eliminate the way that it's transmitted. Many of these things, tuberculosis, for example, are transmitted by aerosol. So simply putting masks on is going to cut a lot of that, but it won't eliminate it. Just cut a lot of it. other things. So, in reality, in terms of a public health issue, the best way to eliminate most of these is to make the potential host, meaning us, meaning the cattle, the pigs, the animals around us, immune to the disease. That's how we wiped out smallpox. We made every human we could reach on the planet immune to smallpox by an aggressive system of vaccination. We came close with polio. It's coming back because there's areas of Western Africa that still have the disease endemic, and they're areas of civil strife, so it's impossible to get into and vaccinate the public. So those diseases have actually started. Polio is starting to make an appearance in the United States again. It's one of the diseases that's watched very closely. So the best way of doing it is to make the hosts, potential hosts, immune, which is a vaccination strategy. Reasons for rapid emergence of AIDS, several. One is international travel. That's why it came about. But then there was the risky sexual behavior of certain groups of people and the risky behavior of intravenous drug users were the major cause. Now, fastest growing population of AIDS patients is heterosexual females, unprotected sex. That's a bigger question. What are 3 public health measures that could reduce the probability that bacteria will develop resistance to antibiotics? Well, education. Educating doctors not to overprescribe, educating patients to take full prescriptions and not demand antibiotics for viral infections because they don't work. Antibiotics are antibacterial drugs. They don't work. So there's ways you can do it, but it all involves making people think and change. Okay. So that's where we're going to end this. So any questions? Okay. Layla, do you have any questions?
No, I don't.
Okay. Then thanks for being on. And I'll see you on Monday. We'll have a textbook for you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye.